You need a government that's pursuing the public interest and not its own self-interest in some version. And you need a government that's competent, that attracts top talent in the society who are dedicated to public service and in the pursuit of the public interest. And if you've got those things and they're reasonably pragmatic, meaning not ideological, modern China, meaning China of the last 40 years, has been the exemplar of what the benefits of doing that and doing it well. If it were kind of my decision, I would not be heading in the direction of maintaining or even expanding the role of the SOEs in society. An unpredictable amount of time, but not an infinite amount of time. You know, the Chinese currency will be, with a relatively open capital account and financial system, will be essentially one of the world's reserve currencies.
So what fundamentally changed China in the past 20 years, from the past 500 that turned China now to a global innovation powerhouse?
In an age where we have to think about the planetary boundaries, and a population that sort of essentially never dies is a kind of scary idea.
Professor Andrew Michael Spence, 2001 Nobel Laureate in Economics, NYU professor. Thank you so much for being with us.
Delighted to be with you.
In your book, The Next Convergence, you did mention that innovation is actually not indigenous to culture. But China has not necessarily historically been a vibrant culture of innovation, particularly in the past 500 years. But 500 years seems to be a long sample period. So what fundamentally changed China in the past 20 years, from the past 500 that turned China now to a global innovation powerhouse?
So there's no question that's true. It has become a global innovation powerhouse, and I expect that to continue and it to become even more powerful, regardless of what else happens in the world. I mean, I think there are basic reasons. You know, one is, as of the reform starting in the late 70s, they adopted an economic model that makes sense, that works, and that combines an important and major state presence in the economy with private sector incentives and initiative and all that kind of thing. Second, you know, they especially coming out into the middle income period, the Chinese government started investing very heavily in scientific research, in tertiary education, in the human capital that goes along with that. And that's just critical. I don't think it's ever been a country that's culturally, you know, disinclined to innovate. You know, I mean, it was pretty innovative in the Ming Dynasty, I guess. But you can set up the institutional arrangements in such a way to suffocate that, you know, including just underinvestment. And I think underinvestment is no longer a problem. You know, so I think you've got a good mix of public sector commitment and private sector initiative right now that's driving a whole lot of innovation in China. I'm not sympathetic to these discussions, you know, that say, well, it's the private sector that did it, because the government is spending a ton of money educating people who then go out and do a whole lot of interesting things. But you get the same discussion in the United States, right? The United States innovation system, when it's working well, is a kind of unstated partnership between the government and the private sector, where the government takes the sort of upstream, you know, open scientific end of the thing. But the other thing I wanted to say, innovation really shouldn't be thought of as sort of one country and the next and the next. And the reason is that sort of information and knowledge flows so freely across boundaries. It's really a collective thing, right? Scientific advance somewhere in Europe will spill over and then advance scientific research, medical research in China and the United States and everywhere else. It really is, so far anyway. To understand it, you need to understand it as a global system.
Absolutely. And talking about the technology, the West currently begins to believe that Chinese companies like Huawei, ByteDance, Tencent, etc., as they start to expand globally, they will necessarily strengthen global authoritarianism. So as a philosopher, Professor Spence, does technology itself carry value, you think?
So the digital area is difficult because we don't have any international agreements of any significance having to do with the appropriate and inappropriate use of digital technology. If the United States government tells IBM, you know, to put backdoors in all their computers and systems, so that if they need them, they can use them to find out what's going on anywhere in the world, there's not much you can do. And there's no international And same for the Chinese government if it says that to Huawei or anybody else for that matter. And so, and we don't have any international agreement saying, you know, at least for companies in this commercial sphere, as opposed to military and national security, we're not going to do that. Now we have treaties in other areas. We have treaties that govern nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons. It's at least in principle imaginable. We could have treaties that that cover digital. So that's part of the problem. And a second problem is that digital technologies, which have been largely, this is a bit of an overstatement because the semiconductors and stuff like that and the internet came out of, in part, out of the government in the United States. It specifically came out of DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration. So it wasn't entirely the private, but a lot of digital technology is developed in the private sector, and then it's turned out to be fairly important from the point of view of national security, right? So you've got the leading drone company in the world in Shenzhen. That young man didn't start out building military drones. He started out building drones where the controller worked better than the one on the helicopter his dad gave. But now we have these drones, right? And they're pretty important. And the third thing is the internet itself. We have very different systems with respect to the regulation of, let's call it social media, right? In China, in Europe, and in the United States, they're not the same system. They're based on different, you know, values, different governance structures and everything else.
Right.
But as a result, they don't mesh very well, right? And so there's a whole bunch of issues having to do with internet content. Do you allow it to flow across borders? Mm-hmm. Well, what about data, right? Does the data flow freely around the world, or is that kind of create a vulnerability and so on? None of these issues. So they're all issues. We know what they are, but we don't know how to resolve them, right? Mm-hmm. So my take on the digital area is we've got a big challenge over the next couple of decades as these technologies become important parts of the underpinning of all our economies and societies, is to sort of tackle these issues. I mean, you can see it, you know, we've taken steps, at least in Europe, to deal with data privacy and security, meaning defining the rights that people have, transparency, what is an appropriate and inappropriate use of data, whose permission do you need to do it, and all that kind of thing. That's really important, because if we don't sort that out, then a lot of the benefits we get from these digital technologies, which I think there's some very inclusive growth patterns if you can share data responsibly. I mean, the research at the Luan Academy in Hangzhou shows that the growth patterns associated with e-commerce and fintech are pretty impressively inclusive in the Chinese case, and I don't think that's unique to China at all. So anyway, we got to sort all these problems out, but we're not very far down the road, at least not in the West.
Mr. Spence, your book, The New Convergence, you contemplated a lot about this interaction of the political and the economic governance. But in your mind, on a wide political and economic spectrum, if we were to draw a chart, where would the ideal government intervention in the economy fall?
It's a really important question. And it's not that it doesn't have interesting answers. It's that the government participates in the economy in so many ways. Probably the easiest way to do it is to tackle the thing in terms of mistakes. So first of all, the government's a regulator, right? Markets by themselves, you know, get out of hand, and that's just the way it is. Second, they have the responsibility to maintain kind of macroeconomic and financial stability. Nobody else can do that. So that's another important element in sort of economic and social development and progress. And third, they're a huge investor, right, in human capital, infrastructure, and all that kind of things. And there, I think the modern China, meaning China of the last 40 years, has been the exemplar of what the benefits of doing that and doing it well. Those things are unambiguous. The other thing people would say is, regardless of where you draw the line, you need a kind of vigorous market kind of oriented system. You need decentralization. You need the incentives that go with that. You need a financial system that's supportive of that whole kind of private sector dynamics. And I think all the successful countries moved in that direction. Then I think you're left with, you know, decisions where there probably isn't a right answer. I don't think anybody that makes any sense, would argue that the Chinese model, which has got this balance in a certain way, isn't working. That's just obviously not true. There's other places where it seems to work pretty well, where the balance is a little bit different. I mean, I think W. Arthur Lewis once said, the problem is you can have a government that's too big and you can have a government that's too small. There probably isn't some right answer right in the middle somewhere there. But what you mainly need is an effective government. You need a government that's pursuing the public interest and not its own self-interest in some version. And you need a government that's competent, that attracts top talent in the society, who are dedicated to public service and the pursuit of the public interest. And if you've got those things and they're reasonably pragmatic, meaning not ideological, they're actually solving problems, admitting at the start that we don't always know the answer before we start and we have to figure it out, willing to conduct experiments when we need to figure out what works and what doesn't. That kind of government, high integrity, dedicated to the public interest, good at communicating, and pragmatic and sort of, good at navigating. That strikes me as kind of the best answer to the question, what kind of government do we want and how will it relate to the rest of society and to the economy?
Now, China's socialism with a Chinese characteristics model. Let's put it in the blandest form possible. Is it capitalism in disguise or is it really socialism?
No, it's a mix. No, I think it's a mix. I mean, it is capitalism. There's lots of, capitalist activity. It's an open capitalist model. I mean, there's lots of foreign investors and there's a lot of cross-border learning now going both ways. It's definitely some version of a capitalist model, but it's one, supported by, complemented by, in the technical economic sense, complements meaning things that go together as opposed to compete with each other. It's supported by a strong, highly competent government that's also an investor. It's an investor, and it's a fairly major force in, what you might call social security, although that's growing. I mean, China, way back, didn't have the resources to have a fancy social security system, so people just saved a lot, kind of on their own. Those resources are getting bigger. But when people say socialist in the West, they mean a government that really wants to participate in all parts of the economy. And then the counter to that is, what's sometimes called neoliberalism, which is, sell everything. China does neither of those two things. It's respectful of the private sector, has a very dynamic, innovative private sector, doesn't really muck that up, has the financial structures that support that kind of economy, but has a big presence. And especially, I mean, if you set aside this SOE thing where there's lots of, I would imagine if you scratch the surface, you discover disagreements even within China about how to do this. Now, they might not surface because it wouldn't be, popular to have a contrarian view on that. But basically, if they went too far down that road, they'd sort of try to dominate the fintech sector, right? They're going to regulate it. But, I don't think anybody is in the central bank or the Banking Insurance Regulatory Commission is confused about where the innovation came from, right? So, I think China's, in some ways it's unique, but it's, I think of it as sort of capitalism with a sort of big effective investing government beside it.
If we look beyond the current era, Professor Spence, looking at a long-term horizon, say in the second half of the 21st century, when China becomes the largest economy and exerting a major global influence, would China at that time be moving towards the neoliberalism end or more socialism end?
No, I don't have any idea, but I can make predictions safely because I won't be around when they turn out to be false, right? At least not at my age. No, I think that would be a daring forecast. I think China's going down its own road, solving problems on the way through. But no, is it going to be like the Anglo-Saxon model, which, by the way, is already changing anyway? Is it going to be like that? I don't think so. I think in China, as far as I can tell from friends and visiting fairly frequently, is, stability is valued. social values are important, so what the Europeans would call social cohesion. Those are natural roles for the public sector. So I don't, who knows? But I mean, I'd be terribly surprised if China went that way. Yeah, no, I imagine the governance structure will evolve, but I don't have much insight into which direction it's going to evolve over time.
China continues in the current era to call for SOE to play a dominant role in the Chinese economy. And we all know that SOEs are not the greatest innovators in comparison to the private counterparts. So is the conception of Professor Spence economically optimal? What would you advise the Chinese government to do about the SOEs?
If it were, kind of my decision, I would not be heading in the direction of maintaining or even expanding the role of the SOEs in society. But there is something that's related to it, which is under the current administration in China, there is a fairly, as far as I can see, a fairly explicit attempt to make sure that the major enterprises, including private ones, have strategies and missions that are consistent, with the overall goals of society. And that means, having representatives of the government or the party in the companies and so on. And that strikes me as entirely reasonable. If we're going in that direction, I'd be inclined to go in that direction rather than sort of having large and potentially, bureaucratic. I think the most dangerous thing is large, bureaucratic, and protected from competition. I mean, a state-owned enterprise that has to compete with everybody else, I don't really kind of worry about it, because if it doesn't do a good job, you won't see it next year, right? I mean, I'm exaggerating, but if it's sheltered from competition, there's lots of problems with that. One is innovation. The other is it's a kind of usually the kind of potential garden for corruption as well.
Following Jack Ma's Bob Summit remarks, I think China has certainly made it clear that it is concerned about systemic financial risks. But I think the systemic financial risks that China is talking about is more than just debt itself, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. So you've already had a relatively unregulated sort of shadow banking system develop, a very Chinese version of that. And they've sort of taken steps to get that under control. And then, by the way, I'm not being critical. I mean, when you have innovation and stuff like this, you get a bunch of things that don't work. But the peer-to-peer lending didn't go very well. So it was a lot of failures and more importantly, a lot of fraud associated with that. So they got their arms around that. And now they have this, very, very rapidly growing fintech system around a lot of things, but the two giants in mobile payments, which is the kind of core foundation on which that's built. And they basically said, they're kind of evolving, so they're starting to act like or originate loans like banks. And so we need to kind of start watching out for whether they're, as that gets bigger and bigger, whether they're going to create, systemic risk in the system. And they seem to be moving in the direction with the Ant Financial of dramatically increasing the capital requirements associated with the loan origination process. Whereas I think Ant Financial's model is, we don't want to be a bank. What we have is a technology that's good at sort of assessing loan quality and pricing credit. So we'll do that for banks for a fee, and the banks can do this. But I think the regulators have said, that model didn't work very well in the United States in the great financial crisis, in the housing part of the great financial crisis. Maybe we really shouldn't go, rushing down that highway, at least not without thinking about it. So I think they're feeling their way along, but I'm not surprised that the regulatory surround of the fintech folks is getting a little more heavy-handed.
Professor Spence, specifically on the 14th five-year plan, what reforms would you like to see as China's priority?
It's just keep them going where they're going. So I think the technology goals are sensible, right? That's the right direction to go. I would change my marketing department and stop calling, and stop describing them as we're going to be dominant or, in first place or some other thing like that in these areas, because it doesn't sit well, and it's not really what they're going to do. And I think the social security systems need to be built out And finally, I guess I would say, I mean, I know this is all part of the 14th five-year plan, and this is an ongoing process. But building out of the financial system and its regulatory structures is really important as well. Good news is there's a lot of talented people, who are getting busy doing all of this. So there's one that's common to all of us, right? Which is we have to get our arms around the climate change issue, or we're going to be in desperately big trouble. And kind of everybody understands that. The question is, are we getting on with it fast?
2020, China's GDP per capita is likely to hit about 11,000 US dollars, but some Chinese economists are still concerned about a possible reversal back to the middle income trap. So what is the lingering risks there?
I think they're very high, to be honest with you. All of the sort of problems that I have seen associated with middle income transitions that didn't work very well haven't happened in China. Sticking with an old model beyond its useful life, no, didn't do that. Failing to invest in the things that support high middle and high income countries. China's doing all that. It's very, very unlikely that China will somehow stall in its progress toward being a prosperous country. It's just not very likely.
Professor Spence, the US is the only major economy in the world that doesn't actually need a foreign currency reserve. So that would be, I think, an ideal situation for China. And so it would be, I think, totally in China's interest to one day, instead of having, buying for a large foreign currency reserve, essentially to buy for the US dollar's status in global trade investment and the currency reserve status at the earliest time possible. Wouldn't that be a reasonable assumption?
Yeah, no, I don't mean, I think, it takes a while to get there because they need to open up the financial sector of the economy in order to get that status. But the economy is becoming big enough. I mean, the problem for little countries with that kind of strategy, if they wanted to have it, is that if the flows can be so big as to destabilize. But China doesn't have that problem. It's an enormous economy, an unpredictable amount of time, but not an infinite amount of time. The Chinese currency will be, with a relatively open capital account and financial system, will be, and I think that's the direction they're going, will be essentially one of the world's reserve currencies. I mean, people will be comfortable holding it. It'll, people will be able to predict how the currency moves against other currencies. They'll be able to sort of move in and out of it without either instability in the Chinese financial markets or restrictions. So the renminbi is already a pretty big, important element of trade, but this is going beyond that. And on the other side, how long the dollar is respected and used as a reserve currency depends a little bit on what the alternatives are. So I can imagine a world in which the euro, it would take a more integrated Europe to get to where we're talking about. But I can imagine the euro, the renminbi, and the dollar all being important, sort of the important reserves currencies. Japan, yes, to some extent, but it's not quite in the same sort of category in terms of size. Right. The other thing is, if America uses its reserve currency status and the things that go with it, like where payments flow through and stuff, to impose penalties, restrictions, sanctions on other people, that if there were an alternative, that would accelerate the movement away from the dollar and towards some other alternative that people prefer. We saw some of that in the Trump administration. You always see some of it, but I think that's probably not the major factor. The major factor is the development of the Chinese financial system, its openness, fully developed regulatory structures, just exactly what's happening, actually.
China has moved into this development phase now, where there is no longer a proven course to follow. I don't think China intentionally tried to export the China model to any country, but if you were to advise a virgin economy today on the path to the future, would you think that the China model has a legitimate role to play there?
My view on that is fairly clear. Which there are common elements of successful models, but everybody has their own, because everybody has unique every country has unique idiosyncratic features. Having said so, what I would say about China is China's, astoundingly successful growth and development experience is well worth understanding and studying because there's important lessons in there that everybody, in the same category should understand, and at all stages of that development process. At that point, you learn what you can, and then you develop. If you're a leader in a particular country, you develop a strategy that you think will work in your country. It's probably going to be an open economy model, where you leverage the demand and technology of the global economy. It's almost surely going to be a high investment model if you can get there. It's going to have a balance between the public and private sector. It'll be what Justin Lin calls a transition economy, which means you can't assume that all of the institutions that you're eventually going to have, both public and private, are all fully developed at the start, because they're not. So there's common elements, and then you have to decide really tough things where economic theory doesn't tell you the answer is, how fast do you open up, right? In what order? Economics basically is a subject that's heavily dependent on studying equilibria. And an economy that's growing at fairly high rates is, in some senses, is partly in equilibrium and partly in transition. The conceptual apparatus you have is useful to some extent, but it's not completely built out, right? Because we don't have a completely built out set of models of transition economy.
But it is rather China that is flowing capital and technology to these developing worlds and the building infrastructure there. So the US FDI, I just checked, has been steadily retracing Africa since 2019. Is the US policy today missing the whole global future by essentially missing the developing world?
No, I think so. Yeah, I think it's been too low on the priority list for too long. Policy is being driven, at least in America, as far as I can see, largely by domestic issues and challenges. And so it's a little hard to make a confident prediction that we'll do an about face on that front. The developed countries in general, including the United States, should have a portion of their agenda directed at making sure that kind of globally the patterns of growth are inclusive. And you're right, China is playing a major role in that as an investor and as a source of technology, and now as a major potential market for these countries. And that's, I think, understood. And then you get into this sort of geopolitical competition at least between the United States and China. And that would be probably not the best reason, but another reason for the United States not to just stay off the global stage in that dimension.
Multi-speed global development. So you did mention that it is not zero sum. In the economic realm, the economy grows, everybody benefits, it's not a zero sum. But in the geopolitical realm, there can be only one global architecture in finance, trade, and global security. And so as China becomes potentially this global economic leader one day, inevitably it's going to reshape the global governance architecture. But in that sense, that's going to be a zero sum, isn't it?
Depends on how you look at it. If you look at it as, we used to have all the power and now we have to share it with somebody, then I guess it sounds kind of zero sum, but it's kind of, to me, an odd way of looking at it. A prosperous world in which the vast majority of what used to be called developing countries and emerging economies actually make it so that their citizens have, large amounts of opportunity was a good thing for everybody. So, I still believe that. So I think whether you see this as zero sum or not depends on kind of what you're thinking about. And I'm serious about that because, if you think about it in a certain way, if you're American and you think, well, if we're no longer the dominant sort of technological science and technology place, we've lost. Well, then you're going to think of this as kind of bad. But if you think about it as, well, gee, we're doing pretty well and they're doing pretty well and we seem to be getting along with each other, sort of, then it doesn't seem quite so zero-summy.
A futuristic question. With human longevity continues to extend exponentially post 2030, and with the rise of AI and the possible infusion of AI with the human race, how do we even comprehend this whole global new paradigm and the understanding of governments and economics?
But I think it's probably better to think about it as a journey that we're going to take and then think about, what we need to do to get there. So my first reaction to life expectancy going in that fashion, is we better get the climate change thing sorted out pretty fast, because the global population is going to get pretty big pretty fast. And we're not all going to stop, using energy and whatnot. So to be honest with you, if that were to come to pass, it would present enormous incremental challenges. I mean, we really are, in an age where we have to think about the planetary boundaries and whether we're living inside them or not. And a population that sort of essentially never dies is a kind of scary idea.
Thank you so much, Professor Spence.